All right, so we have our final lesson here on supporting cognitive functions, and it is the cognitive processing effects of stress, and how do we learn from how stress works, reduce stress when we need to. So first of all, we can define stressors as according to type. So they can be physical stressors, things that are disrupting our ability to do physical or cognitive work in the environment, noise, vibration, heat, etc. Could have psychological stressors, negative emotions, anxiety, fatigue, frustration, fear, and we can have task-related stressors, which have a lot to do with how difficult the task is, and then it can cause some of these psychological sorts of stresses as well. Okay, and what happens to humans under stress? We have our emotions are driven a lot by external stressors, and we have physiological effects, and we talked about in the previous lesson how we can look at some of those physiological effects, heart rate, pupil diameter, etc., um, and we can use them as indicators of high workload, and that would be high workload because it's stressful to be under high workload conditions. So this is all these physiological effects are about the sympathetic autonomous nervous system, and basically it's our ability to react to stressors like this. Our body prepares for basically running away. So they say the fight or flight system, the sympathetic nervous system. And when we see a threat, our body mobilizes to basically be keenly aware of our surroundings and be ready to bolt. And then there are also information processing effects of stress. I've described one of the changes when we have these sorts of extreme stress. But when there's a tiger in front of us and our brain and our physiology and our cognitive functioning changes to deal with the tiger, it doesn't change in a way that would allow us to do some of the more complex, like humans interacting with a complex system sorts of problem solving that humans of today need to deal with. In a simpler time, when we just had one threat here in front of us, it wasn't easier, but it was easier with the mental state changes that occurred due to the stress of this sort of stressor. So what happens here when we have stress, and I'm going to talk about kind of extreme stress, like I feel for my life sorts of stress, because that's where we can get the most extreme sorts of examples. But think of it like a sliding scale. We don't always, we have a homework assignment due, at midnight or something. That's not the same level of stress as somebody pointing a gun in your face, obviously. But in these sorts of cases, this is where we get a lot of interesting anecdotes where people fear for their lives. What happens to their cognitive state? And it's not necessarily negative. There is a change, but again, it has a let's say an evolutionary purpose in that when we have a threat, we generally focus all of our mental energies on that threat and on ways to escape that threat. So we process fewer things, but with greater depth. So I know everything that's going on with this thing that is potentially threatening to me, but whatever's going on over here in the background, I have very little. Very little of my attention is used to process that. So it's kind of like saying, remember with the attention lesson, it's kind of like saying the beam of our searchlight, of our spotlight, that was our metaphor for attention, gets artificially narrowed. So I've got a spotlight on this guy, but everything in the surroundings is darkened as a result. So I give all of my mental energies on this threat. And what happens is in our fight or flight mode, so when we're in our mode where we're ready to bolt, we're ready to run away or to fight, we don't tend to be able to think very creatively. So if we need to come up with a creative solution, we're in trouble. We basically revert to the tried and true methods that have worked in the past because those are simple. Those require very little cognitive processing in order to execute them, and it's all about speed and reliably getting away. And so it's what's worked in the past when I've been in trouble. I'm going to do that again. When we are under less stress, this is when we can be creative. So if you need to be thinking outside the box, you need to brainstorm. Maybe some of you have, dealt with, I've got a project deadline and I got to think creatively somehow and come up with something in an hour. That's harder to do because you've got these stressors that are really inhibiting your creativity, your ability to think freely. So finding a way to reduce stress can make you more creative, but then also more distractible. So it's kind of like being in a broadly divided attentional state when you're under less stress. So some specific effects related to what we've been talking about in earlier lessons. So when we have stress go up, and if we can follow the arousal pattern from the Yerkes-Dodson law, you remember that inverted U, that upside down U, where we've got the sweet spot of performance, and that works with stress as well as this generic term arousal. But we will be able to say with less stress, I may not do as well as with more stress, I may not do as well. There is this narrowing of selective attention, perception and related to selective attention. So remember, this is the guy with the spotlight, and what happens is it artificially sort of narrows that beam if it's higher levels of stress. So the decreased beam width, but I'm also brighter, right? So it's essentially artificially focusing my attention on potential stressors. We can also be distracted. So if it's a relatively benign stressor, something annoying, a mosquito flying around your head or something, it can pull attentional resources away. So it can mess with your selective attention in that way. And we also have a working memory capacity reduction. So we've talked about, in the memory lesson, we've got that magical number 7 plus or minus 2. Well, when people are stressed out, that tends to decrease. And that's one of the reasons why we can't think creatively, because we've essentially got less space on our desktop, on our moment-to-moment consciousness working memory spot. We've got less memory locations to work with, right? So our capacity goes down. We can't think of as many things. We can't solve complex problems as well. Rehearsal is disrupted. So I'm trying to, remember what somebody is saying, and we're using the articulatory loop. That's going to be disrupted. And this whole, all of these things mean it's going to be really hard to learn things. So now, one thing you can take from this slide is you're studying for your midterm, you're studying for whatever you're doing. Realize that, I know it's easier said than done, but if you can try to find the ideal learning conditions, they are low stress. And so maybe you think about, what are ways to relax myself, do the best you can with the limited time you have, I know. But cramming for an exam last minute and freaking out about it is not the right mindset in order for you to be able to most effectively learn things, to store them in your long-term memory, because of all of these limitations that happen to your information processing process under stress. And so then you end up with people who are, highly intelligent and under stress. They don't consider all of the details that they might if they were not stressed, right? So this is not, I think this is not an ignorant woman who doesn't know that the moon is the biggest thing here. But under stress, the little detail like the moon is actually not just an image, on the horizon or some, I don't know what was going on in this woman's head, but you're going to think in a way that is not considering tricks, for example. So with decision making under stress, we tend to process fewer cues. So that's like if I'm thinking about each of these things, one of them would be the size of these things, and there's something lost in the details because this woman's under stress and an elephant is the largest. So I'm processing fewer cues. I'm going to come to an earlier hypothesis that's going to be underinformed, and that hypothesis will persist because I don't have the working memory capacity to compare multiple hypotheses. So yeah, I'm suppressing creativity. So if I've got a new problem I've never experienced before, which the first time you experience a problem is always a new one. You haven't experienced it before. It requires creative problem solving a lot of times. That's going to be a problem under stress. And this term called perseveration here, this is that kind of that automatic, just repeating the same sorts of things that have used in the past, even if it's pretty obvious right in front of you this is not going to work, or to an outside observer, I should say. They'd say, what are you doing? You're just doing the same thing over and over. It's not working. Why don't you realize that? And it's the stress here is just, I can't think. I don't have the working memory capacity to realize what I'm doing is not the best course of action because I can't compare multiples. So we basically just revert to what's familiar. Now, one of the examples I like to use a lot is the burning building example. So this is for me personally. Every day I enter my building where on campus, and I go to my office, and there are 100 different ways, if not more, that I could ascend the four floors to get to my office. I could take stairwells. I could take a combination of stairwells and elevator. I could mix up the stairwells. I could go in through the secret entrance in the basement. I can do it all of these different ways. But if I was always doing it the same way every day, which I tend to have the same usual path, it becomes very familiar. It becomes almost automatic. And now I'm in my office and there's a burning building. And I am fearing for my life. I'm under these levels of stress, and I'm trying to figure out, how do I get out of this building? Well, I can no longer think of, I know there's 100 different ways to get out of here. I think of, what's the way that I come and go from this office? And I will have a really hard time, a surprisingly difficult time, realizing that there are other solutions than the ones that I'm very familiar with that I would normally activate. So one of the ways you can describe this sort of effect here, where we tend to do the same things, we don't realize what we're doing isn't working, and we tend to zero in on really familiar displays and really familiar procedures, we can call this cognitive tunneling. So think of like tunnel vision, but think of that as the searchlight of attention being tunneled in a way. So it's focusing in, and we're really missing things in the periphery that are little details that can make all the difference in trying to solve a problem. And these are observable in a lot of high-profile accidents. We've talked about Vincennes and 3 Mile Island, in the first few topics of this course. These are just two really prominent examples. So cognitive tunneling, this would be another effect here, is your mental model. So if you're a problem solver, so you're this operator here, and things are starting to go wrong, and you have an understanding of how the system works, the mental model. We talked about that in the displays topic. And this model gets simplified because all of our cognitive resources are being oriented towards these things that we see as stressors and not on solutions. And so we can't expand this, we can't adapt it, or we tend not to. And if there's high workload and I'm stressed, this is really a recipe for disaster for your average human problem solver. And so people will then go to the same displays that they're very familiar with. You'll see aircraft cockpits, just looking at their instrumentations in front of them and not realizing the big obvious problem to an outside observer. So under normal conditions, you'd say, well, I'd catch that every time. But I'm fixating here, I'm tunneling. My cognition is focused on a familiar space and not on these unfamiliar, unexpected areas. So I'm less likely to look around for other sources of data that might contradict my current simplified mental model. Okay, so what do we do when we have these sorts of stresses? So first of all, I want you to recognize that these stresses occur in everyday life everywhere. And from an engineering standpoint, I think it's important to consider human operators under these sorts of conditions and under what happens to their cognitive state under these stressful conditions. And that's some of the research we do in my research lab. But assuming these stressors are there and we can be designing to either remediate them or deal with them. Some of the ways that we can remediate, we remove environmental stressors, that's obvious. If people are being distracted in the workplace because the temperature isn't right, or the noise in the vicinity isn't right, or they've got an annoying coworker, you can you can fix that. You can remove the source, the environmental stressor source. And then some very simple solutions related to some of the things we've been talking about in this topic and earlier ones, like display, for example. Reducing clutter or any unnecessary information just adds to the perceptual space without adding to the task at hand necessarily. Think of the data to ink ratio that we've talked about with regard to, I think it was in the displays lecture, and finding ways to get the most information across with the least amount of visual processing. Support memory functions. So memory in particular is susceptible to stress, and especially working memory. So it's like your moment-to-moment consciousness is on fewer things. It's allowed to it only processes a subset, a relative subset of what you normally would. So you want to especially support external memory sorts of solutions, like the recognition rather than recall principle, and then we also talked about that in the memory lesson. The proximity compatibility principle from displays, that same idea can be applied to the stressful situation here, or to designing to support this. If you say we've got a mental model, and what do we need to do in this space, try to make the display components compatible with a healthy mental model. And then support communication. So when people get stressed and they are having suboptimal performance because of the stress, one of the easiest solutions is communicate to a coworker, get somebody else to help, and maybe that person can come in without the limitations of that same level of stress, or maybe they are relatively less affected. I mean, people are affected by stress different amounts. So if you can communicate with people, bring in other perspectives, especially bringing in somebody, like if you're problem solving, bringing in somebody who has a fresh eye on a problem is really beneficial, because we can get so locked in, so tunneled, and stressed about the fact that we're not finding a solution, that it's sort of a positive feedback loop where, we can't find the solution, we get more stressed, it's even harder to recognize, an obvious but different solution, and it becomes obvious when somebody with a new perspective comes in and they say, oh yeah, well, hey, did you check this? All right, so finding a way to communicate among people in order to reduce stress is another solution. And then training. So this is, I've mentioned this with regard to the Vincennes accident, the USS Vincennes in topic 1. And the decision making under stress tends to be bad. And there are things we can do to make it better, or at least closer to decision making not under the negative effects of stress. And one of the ways to do that is through training. So you practice with you've practiced becoming familiar with what you may need to do in an emergency situation, because when there is an emergency situation, you got to be able to rely on something that's familiar to you. Okay, so you're going to be problem solving. If one of the things that you go to immediately, so think like fire drills, we practice these things so that when they do occur, we don't have to problem solve. We just execute what we know we should be doing. So then when these things occur, we're ready to do it. And also you can train people to think outside the box. So you can train innovative problem solving in a simulated emergency environment, and you see a lot of domains that deal with emergency operations and contingencies, where we've got major safety, concerns. They will be really big on these sorts of training things. So, for example, when I've visited oil and gas companies in the Houston area, every time I visited, and I guess this must be by law, but every time I visited, when I enter a building, they always review emergency procedures. To any visitor who comes in, and they always say, okay, at the start of a meeting, here's where the stairwell is, and they're always talking, and this is like a corporate building in downtown Houston, but they're training on these sorts of procedures, because in their domain, so often you need to be thinking about where's the, well, I don't know that often, but it does happen that you need to be thinking about how do I get out of here to safety. And so you want to have a plan in place, and you want all your employees to be aware of this, what they need to do, so you can train them in this way. All right, so with Vincennes, that's where at least that's where I link this concept of stress inoculation. So this was one of the ways that so when Vincennes happened and the U.S. Navy launched this program, TADMUS, the Tactical Decision Making Under Stress program, and one of the big components of that program was presenting people with these stressors. I mean, getting them legitimately stressed out, not simulated stressed out. I mean, to some extent, and having them practice, decision making. So you can fight the limitations of stress in decision making if you train for it. And post-traumatic stress disorder, this would be like a really extreme stress reaction to things, and all of the cognitive effects of that. This is one of the ways that they will treat that, is they'll present the stressor to the person suffering from PTSD, and by repeated exposure, it's kind of like getting an allergy shot or something. By repeated exposure, you don't have such an extreme reaction to the stressor if you were to encounter it in the real world. Okay, that's it for the topic on supporting cognitive functions.